Did Algeria just have a coup? Abdelaziz Bouteflika has resigned after 20 years in office. Was it the will of the people or the will of the military? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the Algerian presidency. Abdelaziz Bouteflika began his career as the world's youngest foreign minister and ended it as one of the world's oldest serving leaders. After 6 weeks of mass protest, Bouteflika caved into pressure on Tuesday. But while Algerians celebrated the 82-year-old leader's resignation, some did so with suspicion. And they may have good reason. Questions are swirling around Algeria that Bouteflika didn't just leave because he lost the support of his military, but because they pushed him aside and are planning a successor. And for many, a coup with the stylings of the Arab Spring is simply not good enough. Mass protests are scheduled to continue until the entire government is dissolved. So who's really pulling the strings in Algeria? The people, the politicians, or the military? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Melinda Nusifora's report.
I thank God for blessing us with this freedom. Freedom for all Algerians.
From a student rally to toppling a president in 6 weeks, these protesters are the embodiment of people power.
We are happy. We are very proud. This is victory, the victory of the people.
Abdelaziz Bouteflika, Algeria's 82-year-old president, had maintained a firm grip on power for 20 years. But he wasn't strong enough to withstand these recent displays of public dissatisfaction. At the end of February, Bouteflika announced he would run for a 5th term in office. Within hours, thousands of Algerians were protesting. In an effort to calm the crowds, Bouteflika revoked his candidacy in March. But he said the elections would be delayed to allow for a transition of power. That did little to appease the protesters, who, by the end of March, had secured the support of the military. Without army backing, Bouteflika had little choice. On Monday, he announced he would step down by the end of the month. Not soon enough for the army chief, who, on Tuesday, repeated his demand that the president be declared unfit for office. Hours later, the ailing leader submitted his resignation.
We won the battle, but we did not win the war. There is still work to do.
Bouteflika has rarely been seen in public since he had a stroke in 2013. Critics say the country is really being run by a shadowy group of wealthy businessmen, corrupt politicians and ambitious military officers. Even though the front man is gone, these protesters say his cronies are still pulling the strings.
God willing, we'll have a 100% democratic transition. This is very important. We need to remove the whole previous regime, and that's the hardest thing. It's hard to do it peacefully, but I have huge trust in the Algerian people to keep it peaceful.
It is the power of shame. They must all go away. They must all leave, and they must be accountable.
Abdelkader Ben Salah, the chairman of the parliament's upper house, will act as caretaker leader until elections can be held. There's also speculation that the military chief who forced Bouteflika's hand is planning his own presidential run.
If we're supposed to be content with the fall of one person, we won't get far. Our real battle is to have a democratic state under the rule of law, with democratic institutions. A new era, a second republic with real sovereignty.
And it seems the people won't rest until they've won that fight too. Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Beirut is Dalia Ghanem. She's a scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center and participated in the protests. In Paris is Chloe Tivan, coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And with me here in the studio is North Africa analyst Lakhdar Ghattas, author of Algeria and the Cold War, International Relations and the Struggle for Autonomy. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Dalia, let's start with you. We spoke before Bouteflika stepped down. Now he's gone. But is the system still in place? Has it really been a victory?
Well, let us be optimistic and say that this is a victory. It is a victory in the sense that, you know, the Algerians took up to the street 7 weeks ago, and they took up to the street in a very peaceful and civic way, and they succeeded in making their president resign without any drop of blood being shed. So it is a victory, and it is a beautiful lesson of peace that they gave to the world, especially to the Arab world. However, let us also be realistic about what has been done and what we can do. The system, the Algerian regime, is a very complex and opaque system, and it is a very complex structure of powers. It is composed by, you know, a pyramid in which at the top of this pyramid there is the Algerian military, and the rest it's composed by several circles of power. These circles are, you know, the FLN apparatchik, the business tycoon, the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. So the regime, the deep state, is still there, and I think it will be very hard to remove it and to enroot it, if I may say.
Dr. Ghatas, was it a military coup by the army when Bouteflika and maybe some of those closest to him were no longer serving a positive purpose to them?
On the semantic side, technically it is a putsch. It is a military putsch. It fits the normative, the standard definition of the removal of the leadership of the state or the threat by force or the threat of using it. The thing is that Bouteflika himself is not illegitimate. He is not in the eyes of the Algerians since he amended the constitution in 2008, and then the fourth term, and then the forced fifth term that was underway. So technically it is, but he is not illegitimate there. When his term is coming to an end in a few weeks, then yeah, but. Polity databases will probably enter it as a coup, a military coup.
Chloe Tivan, so Ahmed Gaid Salah, the army chief of staff, said enough is enough. Bouteflika is not capable. The man stepped down. Is the army trusted enough by the people for them to say, okay, we're going to give you some time to have a transition to democracy?
I believe that on Friday we are very, very likely to see large protests again. I think for a small part of the population, certainly, this may be an acceptable solution. But I do think that the vast majority of Algerians, and I was in Algeria also last week, and speaking with civil society, with young people, and with business leaders and political leaders, and it was very clear that there is a desire for a much broader change, as Dalia mentioned before. And whilst it may not be possible to uproot the deep state in its entirety, I think that there is a lot more needed in order to satisfy the protesters. So it's very clear that even those who seem to accept the army as a potential mediator for this process will not accept the likes of Ben Salah as, you know, interim president, because this is a Bouteflika era appointee who is seen as very much representing the system and the old way of doing things. This is also true for the head of the Constitutional Council and also for the new government, of course, of Noureddin Bedoui. So as long as key positions are held by these people, I believe that there will be continued unrest.
Dalia, you were on the ground, on the streets. For as long as Ben Salah and Bedoui and these guys are around, are people going to be very skeptical?
Indeed, you know, I was on the ground and I marched with Algerians on March 22nd and then on March 29th, and the slogans were very clear. One of them was روح روح يا بوتفليقة وخود معاك قايد صالح, which means go go Bouteflika and take with you قايد صالح. So even if قايد صالح is recognized as somebody who has been in the side of Algerians, people do not want قايد صالح because they don't want an Egyptian scenario. They don't want Abdel Fattah al-Sisi made in Algeria, if I may say. So they don't want Gaid Saleh, but they don't also want Ben Saleh as president of the transition. What the Algerians want and their demand are very clear. They want all the system to disappear. They want the departure of Bouteflika's clan. They want the departure of Bouteflika supporters, and they want the departure of Gaid Saleh and the military to play a less important political role. You know, the Algerian slogan that became very famous in Algeria that says in Arabic, which means you will all be removed, embody exactly what Algerians want. And I don't think that, you know, the Algerians and the street is going to calm down. As a matter of fact, you know, people are already preparing for tomorrow's big demonstration, and they are already organizing slogans, the chants, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that Algerians are going to be satisfied with that.
Okay, and Lakhdar, I'm glad that Dalia brought up the Egypt comparison, because when I bring it up with my Algerian friends, they get very angry. They say, we're not Egypt, and don't compare us to Egypt or any other countries in the Arab Spring. But how realistic is that fear that we will have a Sisi-esque transition here, where we saw when Mubarak went, SCAF came in, and there was a little moment of bubbling democracy and so on, but eventually Egypt went into military hands again. How realistic is that fear, and how wary are Algerians about that?
Well, the comparison is stark, but the political elite in Algeria, I think, is mature now, and more than it was in the 90s. The army in the SCAF in Egypt managed to play the political the opposition against each other and managed to reign over them. That system cannot playbook cannot work in Algeria now. That's one reason. The other thing is that you've seen the series of speeches made by the army, by Gaid Saleh, over the last 6 weeks. They've been very cautious not to appear as overtaking or taking over the power. Remember when the African Union in 2002, they passed a new resolution that the Union will not recognize any regime that in a coup in Africa. And the irony is that Algeria, Bouteflika himself, 2002, 3 years just after he came to power, played a role in implanting that in the constitution of the African Union, because he was fearful then of the army might remove him. The fault lines in Egypt on which the army, the SCAF, played over were the Islamist secularist one. I think we are, to a large extent, not totally, but to a large extent, we are beyond. Certainly, the masses in the streets, it might be in some pockets of the polity of the political leadership or the political society, but the civil society, the masses in the streets who came out, we are beyond that Islamists versus secularists. So I'm very confident that that won't happen, and the army doesn't want to appear as making a coup, an overt coup, although it is technically.
Okay, so you feel civil society is more robust and there's a greater political maturity. Chloe, I don't want to lose the opportunity of asking you about exactly where you are now in Paris. They must be following this closely. The former colonial master of Algeria, the French, they always end up in any conversation with regards to Algeria. What would they be thinking right now, and what would they be planning to do?
Well, it's clear that the French are quite keen that this should be a managed transition, and President Macron actually came out and responded to Bouteflika's statement on 11th of March to say that he welcomed this managed transition. The response within Algeria was furious. People were so angry that France was taking a position in this which they see as being absolutely none of France's business. But throughout the protests, there were a huge number of references to the fact that France should stay out, that Macron should keep to himself. A lot of very, very smart posters showing the cutting of the cord between France and Algeria. And there has actually been quite a lot of imagery that suggests that the regime is, that the pouvoir is very much linked with the French, with the French elites, and that this popular revolution is actually also something somewhat about getting rid of that connection with France, and of breaking this dependence on France.
Dalia, okay. So yeah, let me ask Dalia about that.
There were responses.
Right. Sorry about that, Chloe, because we're running out of time. So Dalia, do you believe that this is an opportunity to make that break with the French?
Well, you know, I think the best that France can do right now and Emmanuel Macron can do right now is to stay put and to avoid any kind of declaration that might anger and frustrate Algerians. As Chloe said it before me, Algerians are very jealous about their integrity and the integrity of their country. So they don't want any kind of involvement. And actually, as a matter of fact, the signs showed it during the demonstration when people said, Macron, do not mind your own business or mind your yellow vest. So I think what Macron should do right now and France is, you know, to watch closely but not to get involved, because Algerians insisted on the fact that this is an Algerian matter.
Lakhta, what do you think about that? How place Algeria right now in this transitional period and its geopolitics, both with looking north at the French and the other Europeans, but also looking at the African continent?
Well, as far as France is concerned, this is a real chance to really establish a real democracy in Algeria, transition democracy, and so that the Algerians will own their own future and their own will of decision and power of decision. That needs radical change, peaceful radical change, the change of the polity, of the leadership, establishments of a real democracy, institutions, accountable institutions, and that would put us on the rails, pave the way to a more robust and a more confident and legitimate leadership in Algeria, with the legitimacy behind the leadership of the country. Then Algeria can speak more forcefully in dealing in the matters and not seek the support of the European Union or of the White House in keeping the legitimate leadership in place. So when this regime felt the heat of the protests, the first thing it did is it dispatched Al-Amamra and Brahimi to the capitals and to Moscow, European capitals, and to Moscow to seek the support, and that was like an abject and stark expression of how this regime is really not in place by the legitimacy and support of its own people. It pretends that it is representing, but rather the force. And we've seen it in the posters. Shame on you, getting behind the international powers against Algeria. As far as the Africa, Algeria, I think one of the problems that mar the Bouteflika's reign is that he disregarded completely let's say, the geopolitical depth of Algeria, Africa. Algeria was one of the founders of the African Union. We've got immense strategic stake in Africa, and yet He never made a single trip
that's a good
to the African nations. See what's going on,
that's fascinating.
In Libya, and Algeria is completely removed from.
He never made a single trip in 20 years. I didn't even know that.
The only thing he made was in 2003 or 4. He made one with Albright to Ethiopia to manage the sort of.
That's a good point. Okay, so it could be an opportunity, right? Listen, we're running out of time. Dalia, I want one final answer from you. He used to be a charismatic leader. He was a hero. He helped bring peace to the country. And now we look at him. He's a sad, fragile old man. He said sorry. A lot of people feel sorry for him when they see these images of him because he can't even say it verbally. Do you forgive him?
Well, you know, I can't speak in the name of all Algerians, but I would say, unfortunately, President Bouteflika tarnished and sullied his image by himself. Until a few weeks ago, he was remembered as, you know, the architect of peace, the architect of the national reconciliation in Algeria, the president who brought back Algeria on the diplomatic arena after 10 years of diplomatic isolation. Unfortunately for him, he is going to be remembered as this old president who was clinging to power despite all the calls for his people just to leave. But I do believe that Algerian will find, you know, the strength to forgive him one day.
Dalia Khanim, Lakhdar Khattas, and Chloe Tivan, it's been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much. Still to come, journalists gagged and bound to the law. Is Australia persecuting reporters for covering the pedophile case of George Pell? And the US government wants Americans back on the moon. Is NASA up to the job, or is the plan just pie in the sky? When former Australian Cardinal George Bell was found guilty of sexually abusing children, the news wasn't really reported in his home country until months later. Why? A suppression order was in place. It forced local media to keep the conviction secret. Gag rules are meant to ensure defendants get impartial juries, but the order didn't stop local news outlets from publishing cryptic headlines, all of which hinted to the public that a major story was being kept from them, even though it was being covered abroad. As a result, Pell might not be the only one going to jail. Now, dozens of prominent journalists are facing sentences for reporting the verdict before they were legally allowed to. Denise Savoya has more on what's become a debate over free speech versus a fair trial.
You're the devil. You're evil. You're a monster.
On December 11th, Cardinal George Bell became the most senior Catholic Church official in the world to be convicted of child sexual abuse. The Vatican treasurer was found guilty of abusing two 13-year-old choir boys in 1996. But the story wasn't covered by local news networks that day. And this is what Australia's newspaper front pages looked like the day after. No mention of Pell and key details left out. The story made headlines in other parts of the world, but it was almost 3 months before Pell's conviction was on the public record in Australia, and that had many foreign journalists wondering why. Before Pell's trial began, the Director of Public Prosecutions asked the judge to grant a suppression order to prevent a real and substantial risk of prejudice to the proper administration of justice. In Australia, suppression orders are used to prevent juries from having information that may unfairly influence their verdicts. That information could include inadmissible evidence or details of previous convictions. In Pell's case, there were concerns that evidence made public during his first trial would prejudice the outcome of a second trial involving similar allegations. On February 26th, that second trial was dropped and the suppression order was lifted. Now, 36 Australian journalists and news organisations accused of breaching that order are facing serious consequences. Some are accused of flouting the order in Australia. Others are accused of helping foreign media organisations report on the matter. The maximum penalty is 5 years in prison and a fine close to $70,000. Legal experts say suppression orders are needed to strike a fair balance between the public's right to know and the defendant's right to a fair trial. But critics say they're outdated and in need of an overhaul.
It's virtually impossible to quarantine juries from social media and the internet. So we need to have legislation that bears in mind this fundamental truth. It has to be necessary to prevent prejudice to the proper administration of justice. And in many cases, that can be done by giving a direction to a jury that they are to put out of their mind the fact that somebody had previously offended.
In Australia, there are more than 200 laws across the country that deal with suppression orders. The Law Council wants those reviewed, modernised and standardised. But there are fears those changes could result in more closed court hearings, which could erode the principle of open justice. Denise Savoya for Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Jason Bosland is the co-director of the Centre for Media and Communications Law at Melbourne Law School. And in Sydney is TV producer and investigative journalist Kate Doak. Thanks for joining us, both of you. Kate, let me start with you. So, looking at it from the outside, is this a case of a free press versus draconian laws? Or is it maybe just the fact that the suppression order was valid, was relevant, the journalist violated the gag order and they have to face the consequences? Which one's closer to the truth?
I think it's a mixture of all of them, because with any free society, we need a legal system which can give people a free and fair trial, no matter what. And I think that given the publicity surrounding the Cardinal Pell case, that in order for that free trial and fair trial, most importantly, to occur, that we needed to have a stable situation where the jury wasn't prejudiced against the either the victims or the perpetrator himself.
Right. Okay.
And
so right. Sorry to interrupt you, Kate. Right. But in this day and age, with Twitter and the nature of social media, and the fact that even if some of these journalists who are alleged to have passed on information to the New York Times, even if they didn't do that, right, the information would have gotten out in this day and age. It's highly unlikely that it could have stayed contained. So I guess the question is, how do you control all of this in this day and age, Kate?
I don't think that you really can in some cases. However, I think that it's important we try no matter what in order to ensure that like a free and fair trial occurs. Now, in this particular case, Cardinal Pell is an extremely prominent figure here in Australia, both politically and socially. And as with everybody else, he deserves to have had a fair trial. And if we can't give him that, what can we give anybody? How can we say to anybody, whether they be a victim or a perpetrator or anyone in society, if we cannot give that fairness to you, what else can we give?
Okay, so Jason, the argument being that violating a gag order from the media when it came to the Pell trial and the accusations that were further in the separate case might have hindered the man being given a fair trial and the two further alleged victims from receiving justice. Your response to that is what?
Well, that's right. I mean, granting suppression orders in these types of cases where you have back-to-back trials are not uncommon. They're not uncommon in Australia, and they're certainly not uncommon in other jurisdictions either. So this case isn't an unusual case in that respect. What is unusual about it is the fact that it involves someone who was a high-profile figure. It involves someone who was being charged with offences which were, I suppose, there's a lot of international attention around those, particularly because of the history of the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, and so I think that the certain circumstances around this case meant that it became unusual. But I certainly think suppression orders, in and of themselves, when you have back-to-back trials, are not uncommon. Certainly, they've been made in England, for example. They're made in other jurisdictions. And they're made in most jurisdictions in Australia. Not so much in New South Wales, actually. New South Wales is probably the one jurisdiction in Australia where there haven't been historically these types of orders made in back-to-back trials, but Victoria certainly, and in other jurisdictions as well.
Okay, so Kate, an argument being that when it comes to the Catholic Church, it's an international institution. It's a story that has captured the international imagination. It's not a local Victoria story. And of course, the allegations, which Pell was later convicted for, involved crimes of a heinous nature, right? With all of that in mind, reporting on it in defiance of a gag order is in the public interest because the public needs to know. What do you think?
I think it is in the public interest. However, with a story of that particular nature, it will eventually be reported one way or another. And if it means that we've got to take a few extra steps in order to ensure that, like, a second trial isn't prejudiced, and that the people who are making the allegations for a second trial or within a second trial, if they're able to be able to put their particular case forward, I think that there's a justifiable reason for us to delay our reporting. That doesn't necessarily stop us from preparing the reports, from doing further in-depth research of our own, which we can then utilize at a later date once the suppression orders have been lifted in any such case. However, I think that in the interest of justice and also in the interest of being accurate, we have got to be very wary of anything we do as journalists whenever there's a media suppression order on a case involving sexual abuse of any form, whether it be a rape case against an adult or sexual abuse towards a minor. I think that we've got to treat these cases and stories with the utmost respect, because we owe that not just to the victims, but to our audiences as well. Because what would have happened if Cardinal Pell had his entire case reported on from the start, and then everything fell apart? Like, we've got to be fair to him as well in regards to this.
Right. Was it the right thing? Sorry, Kate, sorry to interrupt you. Right. Was it the right thing, Jason, for those journalists to feed the info to the New York Times and the Washington Post? Okay, we can't report on it in Australia, but take this info. Yeah, take this little WhatsApp message.
I'm not sure whether or not that's exactly what happened, to be honest. I think the circumstances as they stand are that we don't know how the Washington Post came to learn about the conviction. I'm not sure whether or not there were local journalists who fed that information to those news sources. There was certainly journalists from the New York Times in the court who were reporting on the case, and they didn't breach the suppression order. So the exact circumstances around, for example, the Washington Post or the Daily Beast coming into possession of information about the trial, I think, is yet to be determined. So I think we can't really comment on that. But I wouldn't mind just commenting really on other aspects of the order that I think need to be emphasised. And one of those is that the mainstream media in Australia had every opportunity to challenge the order at the point that it was made. And in fact, under the Open Courts Act, as it operates in Australia, in Victoria, they are required to receive 3 business days' notice of any application for a suppression order, and they chose not to challenge it. And the media sources that I spoke to had said to me, and I spoke to a number, that this order was a perfectly justified order, and if there was ever going to be a case where a suppression order was justified, this is the one.
Right.
So it's odd that then when the verdict is actually announced and the local media can't report on it, that all of a sudden they're making claims about being censored.
Right.
And I think it's a bit hard to swallow, actually.
Okay,
now,
so,
I'm
yep.
I'm not a pro-suppression
Right.
order person. I am someone who thinks that suppression orders should be used in very rare circumstances. At the same time, I think there is a real inconsistency there between the approach of the media when the order was actually made and the approach of the media when the verdict was handed down.
Okay, Jason and Kate, it's been good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
And if commercial rockets are the only way to get American astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets it will be.
The last time man walked on the moon, it was 1972. And for the Trump administration, the wait should be over. But the 5-year deadline that Mike Pence announced to NASA last week was met with some disbelief. Some astronomers criticized the plan as being too fast, too expensive, and lacking political support. So why does the White House want to do it? Well, let's go to our panel. Bruce Pittman is a director at Offworld Inc., a private space firm building robots for space exploration. He also works as a chief systems engineer at NASA's Space Portal Office. Laura Seward-Forsythe is the founder of Astrolytical, a space consulting firm. And back on the program, but making his first appearance in the studio, is retired astrophysicist and astronomy teacher Laird Whitehill. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Laird, let me begin with you. So 2024, it would be the final year of a Donald Trump second term. Those possible political intentions aside, is it a good thing wanting to go to the moon in 2024, by 2024?
It's a good thing wanting to go to the moon, period. The question is about how quickly we get to the moon. So 2024, 2028, which was the original schedule. Getting to the moon in 2024, it's political.
Right.
It's not necessarily a good engineering idea.
There's no Soviet Union these days, so political against whom, for what?
If the Chinese land a man on the moon before we do, it will be a success for them. Just like landing on the backside of the moon, which they did just most recently.
Okay.
So it will make a lot of political hay. But if we get there first, that'll be terrific.
Right.
The fact that we have nothing to do there
yet,
because we don't have the tools to do anything there, will not make a difference as far as Donald Trump is concerned.
I see. Okay, so let's sort of address the politics first and ask you, Laura, do you agree that this is part of a space race against the Chinese to get to the moon fast?
No, I do not. You hear in Mike Pence's speech that he did reference China, but that ignores the fact that we've already been to the moon. We've already won the space race back in the 60s and 70s. This is not a new space race. The only way you can frame it that way is if you say that the commercial companies are racing against each other. The United States is not racing with the Chinese to the moon.
Bruce, politics over science?
I guess the question here is it's not so much, the why or the when, but I think one of the big questions is the how. How are we going to do this? And the other element that Mr. Pence put in there that is different from Apollo is the word sustainable, so that we want to not go back to the moon, but we want to go back there to stay. To have a permanent presence, just as we have on the International Space Station. And that's one of the questions is what is the best way to do that? And so I think there's a lot of activity going on to try to explore various options of how to do that. And I think it's personally pretty exciting.
In terms of the how, is it more likely in this day and age that rather than Donald Trump, rather than Xi Jinping, and Elon Musk could get there first? Is that plausible?
It is plausible. You have some very wealthy and talented individuals, not only Elon Musk, but Jeff Bezos has similar aspirations. So I think, that it's very interesting. And NASA in the past has done partnerships. One of the things that got Elon where he is today is the COTS program, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Program, Services Program that he entered into with NASA in 2006. That allowed him to proceed much quicker than and he has said this himself, that NASA or SpaceX would not be where it is today if it hadn't been in partnership with NASA. So I don't look at this as a competition or a win-lose. I look at this as an opportunity for partnership and cooperation.
Okay, and Laird, looking at Mike Pence's statements and NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, they speak of Mars being part of the long game as well. Right. And in many ways, it seems as if going back to the moon, a manned mission on the moon, is a dress rehearsal for Mars, right? But it leads me to ask, what will we find out on the moon this time around that we hadn't already found out half a century ago?
Well, half a century ago, we actually didn't know there was water on the moon. That actually is news. It's a decade-old piece of news, but it's news. It's not 50-year-old news. They discovered water on the moon 10 years ago, with some of the moon rocks, in fact. But they also went back to the moon with spaceships, and they prowled the moon, they orbited the moon, and they sensed the moon, and they determined that there is water on the moon, and that's new. And so the new space race, and I do choose to call it that, is for the minerals that are on the moon, and the main mineral is water. So we want to go to the moon because the short term is just beating the Russians to the moon, or the Chinese, really. The long term is who's going to mine the resources. And that's 10 years, and that's a 10-year program, at least 10 years before we begin to mine the moon.
Do you agree with that, Laura?
To an extent, yeah. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a race with other countries to mine the moon. It's more of a cooperation and competition between companies. So there are several companies that have indicated that they want to mine lunar resources, asteroid resources, Martian resources for water, and also for other minerals that you find in the moon. And it's very valuable to use these minerals for creating habitable stations. So creating structures, creating fuel depots, and all the resources that we need to live sustainably on the moon for a longer period of time.
What's the best argument, Bruce, to counter those who say the costs are going to be absolutely monumental and this is just not the right time?
Well, and again, it comes down to how you do it. One of the things that both Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have been focusing on is reusability as a mechanism, as a tool to reduce the cost. And both of them have been successful in doing this. I mean, Elon has landed over 30 rockets, first stages of his Falcon 9 rocket. Hopefully next week we'll get to see him land all 3 cores of his Falcon Heavy rocket back on Earth, hopefully next week. And this offers the potential for dramatically lowering the cost. And then you just showed a picture there of his next development, which is the SpaceX Starship and the Super Heavy, which would be a fully reusable vehicle, and that could dramatically reduce the cost. So if you can, there's nothing says that this is going to work, but Elon does have a track record of coming through, not necessarily when he says, but he ends up accomplishing what he says he's going to accomplish. I've learned over the years not to bet against him. So if he says he's going to do it, I think he will ultimately be successful. And that could be a true game changer as far as not only accelerating the pace of it, of this kind of exploration and development. So it's not just about going back to the moon to look for moon rocks. This is the actual development of the moon, putting infrastructure in place to do this mining, to do this harvesting of resources, to do this depoting of commodities in space. And so this could not only speed that up, but dramatically, we believe, reduce the cost.
Laird, do you want to come in?
Yeah, certainly reducing the cost, which Elon Musk is doing and Jeff Bezos is doing, is necessary for the mining of space. But mining of space, what are you doing? What you're doing is going to the moon to pick up some supplies that you can sell back to the people orbiting the Earth. You bring fuel from the moon to the Earth for resupplying perhaps missions to Mars. It makes it cheaper if you mine the moon than if you bring it up from the Earth. And even Elon Musk, with all his talents, and Jeff Bezos, with all his talents, will not necessarily make it cheap enough, but bringing it up from the moon could make a big difference.
Right. Laura, are we living in a a renewed phase of excitement when it comes to space exploration, even to the extent that, I mean, this started a long time ago, but very soon, in a couple of years, the James Webb Telescope will go online, the successor to Hubble, we hope, right?
Because it could be cut back.
Oh, it could be.
Well, I'm just saying, because think about it. If they're going to put more money towards a moon mission, they may cut back.
Would they siphon from?
Nobody said that. That's
James
just
Webb?
my idea.
Oh, okay.
I don't want it to be
well, I hope
true,
not.
because as an astronomer, that would be the worst thing that ever.
I spend most of my time on YouTube looking at Hubble pictures, and I was looking forward to James Webb. Don't crash my dreams.
I don't want to
you're right.
Laura, yeah.
NASA's very committed to James Webb Space Telescope.
Right.
It's committed to the future telescope called WFIRST. There's proposals to maybe cut that budget, but I don't think that'll happen. I think it'll be fully funded. There's a few other missions like the Europa mission that are going to be funded. So yeah, NASA is doing a lot of fantastic science, and along with the Human Exploration Program is the great science it does with its astrophysics and planetary science and earth science programs, and the two need to work hand in hand. And to your guest's point, yeah, the money needs to come from somewhere. NASA can't be doing all of its plans without an increased budget. So hopefully we will see a little bit of an increased budget with the revised budget proposal that they're working on. I wouldn't expect there to be a huge amount of funding increase, however, and so they're going to need to figure out what to balance and how much to cut back on what programs.
Okay, yeah, Bruce, the golden age of space exploration. We picture Kennedy, we picture Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and so on. Can we create a new golden age of space exploration? Is the time right now?
There's a confluence of factors that I think are coming together. So one, the technology has improved dramatically, not only with rocket propulsion and reusability, but just the miniaturization of the technology. If you look at what's going on in the small-sat and the CubeSat world today, that we can do amazing things in really small packages. So that greatly amplifies what you can get into a kilogram of mass that you send into space. So that gives you an ability to do things that you could never do before. I think that the application of AI and machine learning to space exploration and space development is just in its infancy. We're just beginning to see how that could, how those two could play together. And then obviously the automation and the robotics has improved dramatically as far as people and machines being able to work together, and rather than being a competition, it really is a partnership where hopefully we get the best from both worlds, both from the people side doing the things that they do best, and having the machines do the dangerous things that they do best.
Yeah, how much of a factor is that with the combination of these factors, whereas in the past there was no AI, there was no machine learning, there was no advanced robotics? How much help is that?
You got to go into the darkest area of the moon, the South Pole, in craters where the sun never shines, and you're going to walk around. You can't do that. You're going to send robots in there. Those robots have to be our surrogates. They will be the ones that do the mining. We're not going to be there with a pick and shovel doing any of this. Those robots will be our servants, and we have yet to develop those, but we need to do that in the coming decade.
And Laura, so the moon by 2024, that's the plan. And then the first step to the manned mission to Mars, and they've set a date on that, 2033. Is that realistic? Is that doable, Laura?
It is quite aspirational, to use somebody else's term. It is not very realistic that they will accomplish those goals by those time frames. We've seen significant delays in the recent past with NASA's plans. NASA decided that they wanted to return humans to the moon in 2017. That's when President Trump signed a policy directive directing NASA to return humans to the surface of the moon almost 2 years ago now. And we haven't seen huge significant progress towards that. However, with this speech that Vice President Pence gave, we are seeing a bit more of an accelerated schedule, a bit more of a hustle, if you will, where NASA is trying to decide how it can accelerate its schedule, how it can get there in 5 years. I would say that it is possible that they can accomplish this. Technologically, it's possible they can accomplish it. Politically and financially, it is a question about whether they will. And right. I'm a little bit skeptical that they'll actually accomplish this within 5 years, but I really hope they do.
Yeah, I am too.
Yeah, I was watching The Martian with my daughters, and they took it for granted that we'd already been to Mars.
Yes.
So the kids have high expectations. Bruce, 2033, is that possible, getting to Mars?
Yeah, Mars is a tough problem. And again, it's one thing if you just want to go to Mars and just say you've been there. But again, if we want to do it sustainably, you need to put the infrastructure together. And clearly there's some safety issues and some astronaut health issues that you have to deal with. Prolonged exposure to deep space where you're outside of the protective cover of the Earth's magnetic field, out beyond the Van Allen belt. You've got both solar radiation that you have to deal with and a thing that's mysteriously called galactic cosmic radiation, which are very high energy particles that you have to deal with. So we're still trying to figure out how serious a problem that is, how to deal with that. I mean, it's a solvable problem. If you have enough mass, you can do that. But if you want to carry that mass, then it takes fuel to carry that mass, and so it's a tough problem. And then it's a long ways away. When compared to the moon, which is just around the corner, and compared to Mars, it's 3 days to the moon. It's 6 months or more to Mars, and then you only get a launch window every 26 months. Where the planets align so that you can go and come back. So it's a much tougher problem. But I think that if some of the things that we're working on now come to pass, I think it's doable.
Wrap us up, Laird Whitehill. Final answer.
Pence made an announcement that we're going to go to the moon in 5 years. In order to do that, there needs to be increased budgetary allocation for NASA. Without that, the current program cannot get there. With an increased allocation, there is a way to get to the moon in 5 years. It may not be the best choice to get there in 5 years. You may have to sacrifice and we did not talk about this, the Lunar Orbiting Gateway space station around the moon, which is part of our plan to go to the moon. We may have to sacrifice that in order to get there in 5 years. We haven't discussed that today, but it's a really important part of the question.
Okay, we'll look into that the next time we talk about this, but it's been great. Really enjoyed that. Laird Whitehill, Bruce Pittman, and Laura Seward-Forsyth. Been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. Thanks again. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.